Lydia Wilson, a journalist for New Lines magazine and the presenter of the BBC series The Secret History of Writing. I'm sitting with my friend James Montgomery, the Sir Thomas Adams's Professor of Arabic at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of the British Academy. This is one of 4 episodes in a series considering authors, texts and ideas from the rich heritage of classical Arabic literature.
A reading from Al-Jahiz, the Book of Living Beings, Volume 1. What fertile pastures a book is! What a capacious storehouse! What a companion and tool! What a diversion and charm, distraction and occupation! What a comrade in times of solitude, an informant when travelling in distant lands! What a guest and helpmate! Wise vizier and welcome visitor. The book is a receptacle full of knowledge, a vase replete with wit, a vessel laden with levity and gravity. It can be more eloquent than Sahban or less articulate than Batil, if this is what you're looking for. You can laugh at its novel tales or be amazed at its singular bizarreries, if that's what you're looking for. Or you can be diverted by its rare witticisms or moved by its admonitions, if that's what you're looking for. Where else can you find the charming excoriations, moral instructions that entertain and divert, an ascetic who is also a debauchee, a speaker who is dumb, or a wit who is so tepid and dull that he stokes the flames of your anger? Where else will you find the Bedouin physician, a Roman Indian, a Persian Greek, an aged newborn child, a dead body kept alive? Where else will you find an object that combines both the beginning and the end, the deficient and the abundant, the hidden and the evident, the visible and the invisible, the high and the low, the lean and the plump? In short, one thing and its opposite.
In 750 of the Common Era, a new power swept the Muslim world, ousting the Umayyad Caliphate and consolidating the huge empire, which then ran from the borders of China through to southern Europe. This new power was the Abbasid dynasty, a family descended from the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, and it soon established itself not only as a formidable political and military power, but also a patron of intellectual and artistic movements. Under their early rule came an astonishing period, now called the Translation Movement. In the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, a huge variety of Greek texts, many via Syriac, poured into Arabic intellectual life, stimulating a culture full of debate in books, courts, and public spaces, particularly around the urban centres such as the capital, Baghdad. This is the milieu in which the philosopher known as Al-Jahiz lived. He was born around 776 of the Common Era in Basra, in the very south of current-day Iraq, living an incredibly long life, dying in 868 at least the age of 90 in Baghdad. In this time, he published an extraordinary amount. On some counts, he wrote 245 separate works, in works that span politics, theology, literature, studies of countries and of people, all the way from misers to singing girls, arguing the merits for different cultures and ethnicities. In some, he showed a curiosity and originality rarely seen in history. Is that fair enough?
That's a very, very fair description. The characterization of Al-Jahiz as a philosopher is interesting also. It's not one that normally made. Normally he would be simply classified as a polymath, because scholars have a difficulty in understanding whether what he did was philosophy or theology or an activity all of its own. I tend to think of him now just as a scientist.
A scientist?
Yes.
That's a difficult word for somebody who comes from history of science.
Yes, I know it is. And I may have been a little bit naughty in choosing it.
How is he a scientist? I mean, his work on singing girls, his work
Yes.
on theology, literature.
Yes.
Where do you get science from?
Because his primary interest was in the human being, and in understanding how human beings operate.
Right.
And so he's a science of the human now. And I don't want to use the word anthropologist because it wasn't. I don't think he was an anthropologist. But also because of a lot of his underlying ideas about how the world is structured and how human beings are put together, they were informed by scientific developments in his day. So,
Scientific.
yes,
Why not just intellectual?
possibly. I'm not gonna argue the.
Yes, I've become allergic to it, I suppose, because it was coined in the 19th century. So to take it back to such a different context is very difficult, and it comes with ideas of measurement, empiricism, that kind
Some
of.
some of those ideas I actually want because they're not normally associated with him.
Ah,
These are not normally associated as a consistent thinker with a coherent approach to creation and to reality and to humanity. He's often thought of almost as an undisciplined child with an uncontrollable curiosity and an endless desire to be funny. So from my non-scientific background, wherever the history of the word is, scientist perhaps makes him seem too grand, but it gets across the fact that we have to deal with this individual, and not just as a thinker of disparate interests, but as someone who was involved in what were the cutting edge discussions of his day around atomism and the composition of reality.
yeah.
And we have to see through the barrier of misers and singing girls, as fascinating as they are, to actually wonder what's going on underneath.
Right.
And just I was watching a program recently from 1987 called The Great Philosophers, in which the philosopher politician Brian McGee was talking about the American pragmatists. And one of the pragmatists they were discussing was C.S. Peirce. And Peirce was a scientist but made some of the most incisive contributions to logical thinking in order to put the foundations of his scientific approach on to secure them properly. And I was very much struck by this, that someone his interests were, as it were, ultimate interests were elsewhere, might spend so much of his time working on issues that we would think were perhaps peripheral to his principal interest.
Yeah.
And so that led me to think a little bit more about Jahiz from the point of view of C.S. Peirce, as it were.
Yeah. Well, he was obviously extraordinarily brilliant. And so we shouldn't just focus on the potentially more frivolous sounding works.
Yes.
But it's not just his works, is it? Like all sorts of parts of his character have come down to us as real legends. I mean, can we start with his name? What does his name mean? I mean, the name we call him, Al-Jahiz, which isn't his given name, is it?
No, it's the way that Arabic names work. He was Abu Uthman, which means the father of man. A father of Uthman, Amr ibn Bahr, Amr, the son of Bahr. And the name by which he's often referred to in the later tradition, Al-Jahiz, seems to mean someone whose eyes were particularly prominent in their head. So having some form of ocular defect that caused his eyes to be very, very prominent in his...
But a recognised word, so he's basically called Goggle Eyes.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's odd, right? Or
I don't know that anyone would have called him that to his face, or that's how he would have been known in his circles. I mean, it's not clear to me that that might have been the name by which he was, as it were, generally known in the society. He would probably have been known as Abu Uthman.
that's just come down to us.
Yes. And, that's, again, part of this mythologizing tendency in which names become attached to individuals through their activities.
Yeah.
And through his writings, that someone who was interested in so many different aspects of everyday life, from toilet cleaners to princes, must somehow have been visually different, and marks him as an outsider.
An outsider.
And the way that I want us to try to think of him is someone inside his society and not as an outsider.
Oh, well, do you mind me exploding some of these other myths then, or asking you about them? Just for the
by all
moment,
means,
stick
yes.
to the myths for the moment. So
By all means.
I did a quick Google search.
Yes.
Sorry if that's a bad way of doing research. But I did an image search.
Yes.
And there's an extraordinary range of images of Jahiz. Like, there were medieval manuscripts, but there were Iraqi postage stamps. You know, he's famous.
Yes.
But they were uniformly ugly and black.
Yes.
Where's that come from?
So uniformly ugly is because partly that someone with eyes protruding from their head would be, in terms of cultural norms of aesthetic appeal, would be unattractive, i.e. would be considered ugly. So there's that point. There's that point. The other point about the blackness is that there is an anecdote recorded in a work not long after Al-Jahiz's death. And when I say not long, I'm talking about 100 years. But in our in our universe, that's not a huge length of time, which is traced back to his nephew, who said that one of Jahiz's grandparents was black.
Right.
Now, I will leave it to experts on race out there whether that makes a person black. It doesn't make them black. But of course, we're very, very, very familiar with racial stereotypes that make a connection between blackness, bulging eyes, and ugliness.
So you're saying it was a racist trope of the time?
Possibly.
Is that
possibly
one way of putting it?
Possibly. When I tried to explain, Jahiz nowhere refers to himself, as far as I'm aware, as Jahiz, and nowhere refers to his colour.
And we have the single source.
Yes. Attributable to a nephew who said that one of his grandparents was black. There are lots of stories about the ugliness. Is a famous one in which a woman in a jeweller's shop is so terrified that she thinks it's Satan, Iblis, the Arabic for the devil, has walked into the shop, and so on. But the interest in him then as the comic outsider is what gains traction within the tradition. So if I strip it all back, I'm left with this one anecdote attributable to a nephew that one of his grandparents was black, that he probably did have some form of visual deformity or unusualness, an ocular condition. I believe it's called ophthalmia, but don't quote me on that.
Is that why? So you're saying that that's why these myths have been so persistent, that an outsider is somehow easier to label?
There is that. That's possibly the starting point. But the outsider who is then able to chart such massive diversity within a society, right? The
Yeah.
outsider gets access to bits of society that the nobleman
Yeah.
wouldn't, right? So the outsider, Jahiz seemed to have access to all walks of life, to people who worked as bargemen working on the Tigris, to slave girls running errands, to, I mentioned earlier, to people who cleaned out the toilets. That this diversity of subject matter tends to encourage in a tradition a reaction formation that wants to tidy it all up, to explain it all away. And this becomes the easiest. And of course, it then features into issues in our own society about representation. Wouldn't it be great if one of the most prominent 9th century authors, right at the very birth of Arabic prose, would have been black?
Ah, so there's been a renewed reason to claim it.
Yes.
And so what's your reason for trying to reclaim him as an insider rather than an outsider?
My reason for wanting to do that is that I think it simply forces us to look beyond the detail, to try to listen through the cacophony of slave girls, of bargemen and everything else,
Yeah.
to try and get behind the veil.
Yes.
So that I'm perfectly prepared to be proven to be wrong, because it's not about being right or wrong in this instance. It's about trying to penetrate the legend and see if there is anything else behind that legend
Yeah.
that might also explain the same diversity of interests,
Yeah.
but not be, as it were, explained away or dismissed as a stereotype or whatever. So my attempt is really to rehabilitate Jahiz as a serious thinker,
Right.
which is why I was using the word scientist earlier, because in my non-scientific mind, I think of scientists as serious, right?
Okay, well, by the end, you might have convinced me. Let's see
Yeah.
about that use. Well, linked to that use of the word scientist, actually, the top hits from my Google, not the image search, they were also interesting about how his reputation has endured, because the most common ones were all to do with him as, I quote, the father of evolution.
Yes.
Now, evolution happened 1,000 years later in terms of the term and the theory as we
Yeah.
use it, which is from Darwin.
Yes.
So where does Jahiz's label come from?
So let me begin with a story I once heard, and I can't remember where I heard this, and whether someone told it to me or on a bored afternoon I got lost on the internet and came upon this claim. But it was said that the British Library had a copy of Al-Jahiz's most famous book, the Kitab al-Hayawan, the Book of Living Beings. And this is the book in which he explains how he thinks the natural world operates. And that copy in the British Library had gone missing and had been checked out by none other than Charles Darwin. And that Darwin, therefore, not only being such an important intellectual and innovator, but miraculously learned to read Arabic. And had miraculously learned to read the type of Arabic that is not easily approached by someone without a lot of years of training.
And he didn't tell anyone.
And didn't tell anyone, didn't return the book, and pilfered all the ideas. So, and what the story sort of identifies is the sort of urge, the movement at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century, in which, on a larger scale, and I'm not attributing this type of argument to any of them, but there was an incipient Arab nationalism that wanted to argue that the Arabs were not inferior to the West. Right?
Yes.
and it was
Yes.
it was connected with political movements towards independence and self-determination and so on. And so the identification within the Arabic tradition of precursors, if not, in fact, inventors of the major Western scientific achievements became a sort of idée fixe.
And yeah, looking for a point of pride.
Yes.
But what's the evidence? They didn't spin it out of nothing. What is it about Jahiz that lent itself to this?
Well, there are some aspects of Jahid's thinking where he describes how animal behaviour is tied to its environment.
Yes.
How animal behaviour can be conditioned, if not determined by environment. The theory that hot regions will produce animals as well as human beings that have certain characteristics because they live in hot regions. There's also notions of intra-species competition.
That's the key, isn't
That's
it?
the
I
key
think
one.
the other ones had been around before.
Yes, but the key one is that there is competition among the species, but as far as I can tell, in any of Jahiz's writings that I've read, there is no sense of competition within a species.
Right.
Right? So there is survival of the fittest, but the lion is more powerful, as it were, than the cat.
Yeah, yeah.
Or than the dog. But there's no sense of Jahiz that the lion is fighting with the lion in order to be the rightful procreator
of the species.
of the species.
Yeah, so the strongest survives and the strongest.
Yeah, so there are things that, with a very, 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 very generous interpretation, could be made to look plausible.
I mean, that's true of an awful lot of scientific theories. They build on other things that
and
people have
Jahiz
noticed.
isn't the only one. I think you might come across, if you were to Google al-Biruni, that he is accredited with evolutionary anticipation. And so on.
Evolution, really?
I believe so. I may be misremembering that.
Let's
wasted
talk about
afternoon.
al-Biruni another time.
Yeah.
That would be
With
great.
pleasure.
And also what I think happens when people look for those sorts of precursors is then the books themselves, the original books, start being misread because they're being mined, aren't they?
Yes.
And Jahiz's writings are obviously so rich. Al-Hayawan in particular, it's a monster, isn't it?
Oh, it's a massive book.
So tell us about
it's
it.
It's a terrifyingly large book. I put off for many, many, many years attempting to come to terms with it because I found it just too daunting. But I attached this project in my mind and had made good advances on the other half of the project, but I felt that it wouldn't have any academic merit unless I tackled the Kitab al-Hayawan. And so reluctantly, kicking and screaming and wailing and weeping, I used a sabbatical. I'm very fortunate at Cambridge to have a very supportive sabbatical scheme, and I was given a year's academic leave, and I decided that was a time at which I really had to come to terms with this book.
To face it.
Yeah, and I haven't even begun to scratch the surface, I think.
Really?
Yes.
So tell us about the book.
So the book is roughly in 7 volumes, and it deals with all sorts of debates and all sorts of issues and all sorts of animals. It covers everything from flies to camels to dogs.
Humans?
Humans by implication, I think. Not necessarily. There is no section of it that is specifically devoted to the human animal. But also, there's a section, a discussion of fire, because fire was thought somehow to be alive.
Did
Right.
that come
Don't
Was
know
that-
where don't know where it came from.
not related to jinn?
Possibly
Possibly, yeah.
the jinn, the genies being composed of fire.
Fire, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so what approach did he take in all these 7 volumes devoted to animals? Or
The approach is largely, at first blush, I think the work was dictated to a scribe, to an amanuensis,
Okay.
and not written by hand.
why do you think that?
Partly because of the structure of the work, partly because also I think by the time he was trying to finish it, he had suffered from a stroke. And in another work, he refers to the difficulty he had in pronouncing some words. I know that my theory has begun to be that this is the case, has been attacked in some areas, but that's fine. I'm not fussed about that. But for me, also the very loose way in which it's composed, his method is effectively to bring together under one heading all of the items of poetry and items of knowledge and anecdotes relating to any given animal and bring them all together. It's almost as if we have a book that's made up of many, many folders. If you think of the book as Dropbox, then there's a folder on Dropbox which deals with flies. And that folder contains everything that he knew and had access to through his memory or through his available resources on flies and so on.
So was the aim encyclopedic?
I think the aim, that's a tricky question because I'm not sure. I don't want to admit the word encyclopedia into the discussion because it's not an encyclopedia, I don't think.
Because that's a technical term.
Yes.
Yes.
And I react to that the way you reacted to my use of the word scientist. So
So we're even.
I'm a bit chary of the word encyclopedic. I think it was an attempt to provide an account of the totality of the world around him.
So in my uneducated state, that the encyclopedic means that.
Yes.
So we'll say no, that's a technical. Anyway, right, okay. He's
Yes.
aiming to be comprehensive about his sources.
Or about the world around
About
him.
the world, right,
Yes.
right. And so is there any original sort of investigation of the world, or is this textual?
No, there are references to experiments.
Right.
And, there are references to sort of experiments on animals, ones that we would disapprove of.
Oh. Vivisection?
None that I can remember or that I could find. But sort of taking a snake and injecting venom into its nostrils to see if the venom would kill the snake, for example. But there
And did it?
no, I don't think it did.
Okay.
I think it upset the snake considerably, but there's another one that's a little bit more palatable, and that is going out into the desert scrub around Basra with a net at night, lighting a fire, capturing as many of the insects that are attracted to the fire as possible, and trying to catalogue and analyse them.
I can sign up to that as science, and I
Yes.
wonder if we did it again today, what the comparison would be. That would
Yeah.
be fascinating.
Yes.
Because people still do that. It's a moth trap.
Yes.
I mean, all of this is just to kind of get at the fact that by the time he wrote that, he was so highly educated. What do we know about the training and the education and the reading?
Part of what we know about his education is connected to another aspect of his legend that we haven't discussed, that he grew up very poor
Oh, yeah.
and is reputed to have sold fish in the market at one point or whatever. And this aspect of his education, of course, is in the University of Life. Right? that through being, as it were, almost a street urchin, he was able to experience all those things. But formally, we know that in the Great Mosque in Basra, which was the equivalent of the modern university, where you could go and study various subjects, that he probably studied grammar and lexicography with some of the foremost thinkers of the day, that he would have listened to lectures on Islamic law, that he would probably have attended classes on metaphysical subjects like atomism and so on. So through gaining access to the study circles that were based in and around the Great Mosque of Basra, he would have had a comprehensive education in the Arabic sciences, language-based predominantly.
Yeah, and Islamic.
And Islamic.
Sciences.
And he would have studied Quran, and he would have studied exegesis of the Quran.
Yeah.
And so on.
And we're talking about the late 8th century, basically.
Yeah, I guess we're probably somewhere around 780, 790.
And so we can kind of assume he wasn't selling fish.
That was my implication.
And, sorry.
It's another aspect of the legend that I want us to put aside for the time being.
And he emerged into adulthood, let's say, with a really thorough grounding in the curriculum of the day.
Yes, yeah, and poetry, I should have said. He would have studied lots and lots of Arabic poetry, because lots of the language sciences were dependent upon the study of Arabic poetry. Right.
And so then, do we know what he went on to do? What do we know about his life?
Very, very little. With any certainty.
Just from the books he wrote. That's the main evidence.
There is that. There is a reference in one of his own books to the Caliph al-Ma'mun, who reigned from 813 to 833 of the Common Era, being impressed with some works that he wrote on the question of the imamate, which is effectively a question dealing with who has the right to lead the Islamic community.
Yeah.
And that encouraged al-Ma'mun to invite him from Basra to Baghdad. And that he embarks on that element of his career in Baghdad, where he becomes more or less almost a court intellectual, if you like.
Right.
Well, and it's very difficult to know which writings should be dated to that period.
Well, I mean, this is what I touched on in the introduction, right? That the courts were an incredible place of patronage.
Yes.
And it was a pretty exciting time to be a philosopher, I would say.
Yes. I mean, he was there at exactly the right time, because you mentioned in your introduction the translation movement.
Yeah.
Al-Ma'mun was a very, very enthusiastic sponsor of translations of ancient Greek and ancient Indian learning into Arabic, usually via the medium of Syriac for the ancient Greek, and obviously directly from Sanskrit for the Indian. But there was a sense that the Abbasids, they were adopting an Iranian model of civilization which required a proper inventory of all aspects of the kingdom, and this led to the massive investment in translating ancient Greek philosophy, science, mathematics, zoology in our case for Jihad. So any works by Aristotle they could get their hands on, they were translated.
Yeah.
And then retranslated if the first translations, particularly in the more hard sciences, shall we call them, like...
no, that's not.
But in the ones that could demonstrably be shown not to be functioning. So let's say there was a mistranslation of an equation.
Right.
Then they would go back and retranslate. And there emerged a whole cadre of Christians working at the Abbasid court who were translating these works from possibly Greek into Syriac, and then Syriac into Arabic.
Yeah, with the Christians already knowing Syriac,
Yes.
sometimes their first
Yeah.
language even,
Yeah.
and Greek.
Yeah, and so Jahiz was there when all this material simply became available. And I think that by being a member of the court intelligentsia, he would have had access to those books because access to them would have been restricted.
And also, as you know from being a translator, you can't just translate like it's just you're a Google translate and it just passes through you.
Yes.
There was engagement with these ideas hugely.
There was a debate about whether one, and they're very familiar till today, should one translate it word by word?
Yep.
Should one translate a larger unit of sense? So do you want to communicate what each word means, or do you want to communicate what the sentence means?
Right.
And we have examples of both types of translation from the early period. And some of the works that were translated, I should mention this because they're key for Jahiz, were translated from Old Iranian Pahlavi, that's Middle Persian,
Yeah.
from Pahlavi into Arabic. So Greek into Pahlavi into Arabic. So
Oh, yeah.
the logic works of Aristotle, some of them came through epitomes, so condensed versions that had been available in Middle Persian and were translated into Arabic, because the Abbasids, unlike the predecessors, the Umayyads, who were very, as it were, Western oriented, i.e. more focused on Byzantium. The Abbasids were Eastern focused and more focused on ancient Iran and the Sassanians.
Well, and that Eastern focus actually brings me to a different type of breakthrough that came with the Abbasids. And that's when they reached all the way east and the so-called Battle of Talas, I think.
Yes, yeah.
So that's 750, 751.
Yes.
On the borders of China against the Tang army. And as legend has it, we know not to listen too much to legend by this point, but amongst the spoils of war, they captured a paper maker. And this had been a very closely guarded secret of the Chinese. They wouldn't share how they made paper. But the Abbasids learned from this mysterious Chinese papermaker. And he divulged the secret technique, which was from the bark of mulberry trees, pulped down and kind of felted and squeezed and whatever. But back in Baghdad, this was transformed because there weren't so many mulberry trees.
Yes.
And they figured out they could use it with other materials like rags.
Yes.
How important was that?
As important as Wi-Fi has been in our society in the last
Wow.
10 or 15 years,
wow.
it's just all of a sudden it makes so many things possible.
What?
Prior to that, if you wanted to copy a book, you either had to use animal skin in the form of vellum or parchment, or you had to use leather. And of course, both of these react to ambient temperature. So leather in particular is very difficult to cure in such a way that if the air is moist, it doesn't react to the moisture in the air. And this is a complaint that Jahiz himself makes, that writing on leather is not a good thing.
It's not just that, it's the sheer expense of an entire cow being used to make a few pages.
Yes.
I mean, a Quran takes a herd of cows. That's, maybe 250 of them.
Yeah. Of course, these were also luxury items, these Qurans.
Right.
I mean, they were prestige items. And so they should cost that amount. Not necessarily the cows, but the equivalent of if one could have done it otherwise. But what rag paper really made possible was in the imperial bureaucracy, it made notes easy to do, like receipts and transfer of information. So it very quickly became part of the bureaucracy. And there seems at one point for all three technologies to have been maintained, vellum, leather, and rag paper. But in our case, what it did do was it led to the emergence of a profession known as the waraq, the expert in a waraq, which is a sheet of paper.
Right.
So you get the paper man. Now, I don't want to call him a stationer because he's not like a shop that you go into and buy paper clips or whatever, but partly he's a stationer. He's an expert in sourcing paper, but interestingly, he's also an expert in copying books.
Right.
So what really happens is that the few copies of Aristotle, for example, that may have been made for the caliphal court could then be copied and then distributed, and i.e. sold.
And there was an army of these, basically. A
Yeah,
whole profession.
Yeah, so eventually we end up with a souk, with a market, so-called warakin, the paper makers' market, and they doubled up as booksellers, and I think to a certain extent lending libraries. I think you could go in and pay to have access to their copy of Aristotle's Zoology rather than buy it yourself.
Oh, wow.
I might be wrong. I mean, it's a sort of hunch because when we hear about one of the other late legends about Al-Jahiz's death, that when he dies in this paper maker's shop, crushed by a pile of books, it's because he had rented out the shop for the night.
Yes.
Right? So I'm imagining that, when it comes to buying and selling, human beings can be very predictable. I don't see that a savvy paper maker in Baghdad might not have thought, I will just let someone use my shop if they pay me overnight.
Yeah.
And that in its turn leads to the emergence of no longer a court-sponsored author, but a writer who could try to make a living through making his books available.
Right, so we've got a whole different class of writing, a whole different profession.
Yes, and within about 40 years, by the end of the 9th century, the type of scholar like Jahiz who would have depended upon the patronage of an elite member of society for his living doesn't cease, but there are then those scholars who are able to survive just through writing. Most scholars had to supplement their authorial actions through being copyists themselves. So you hear about a lot of people. Tawhidi, who comes often compared to Jahiz in the following century, is very bitter about this. He's always complaining about how he has to spend so many hours a day copying so many sheets of someone else's work when he would much rather be writing his own. And so the rag paper, some people have argued that there were in fact paper mills on the Tigris and Euphrates that were churning the power needed to make the paper out of rags. And all of this leads to a kind of knowledge explosion.
Right. Yeah.
So the mobile phone combined with Wi-Fi leads to social media explosion.
Yeah, and everyone consuming information.
Yes, you've got the two requirements.
Right.
And the third then comes. And in one of his works, Jahiz says, he talks about the dangers of this, that there are people who are writing books and claiming to be Aristotle. And so you also get the fake authorship, i.e. fake media phenomenon.
Disinformation.
And disinformation in which someone will write a book, claim that it is by Aristotle, and launch it on the market.
9th century fake news.
Yes.
Do you also get that fear of mass information that came with printing, that came with the internet, that this is somehow bad for us to have access to so much?
What you get, not necessarily in Al-Jahiz himself, what you get in related disciplines that were very, very memory-based, such as collecting the hadith, the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, there were those who said that writing shouldn't be used for this, that it should only be done through memorization. And the reason for that was that the key mechanism to verify authenticity was the person that you received the report from.
Yeah.
So, because you can't trust the provenance of a book and the information contained in the book, you can't trust, as it were, the book doesn't have any ethics in and of itself. It doesn't have any moral standing.
Yes.
And the secret to preserving the authenticity of this chain of authority that goes back from someone in the 850s way back to Mecca and Medina during the Prophet's lifetime is the probity of the person passing on the information.
Right.
And so writing seemed to threaten that completely by breaking the chain of verification and veracity.
Yeah.
Jahiz himself, he's more worried when it comes to books about such things as forgeries, and for him, I think the book was a mechanism whereby you, the reader, could then go and consult him, the author. So what I'd like to sort of what I'd like to draw out here is the fact that the book is not an end in itself.
Right.
It's not a final product.
Right.
It's the beginning of a conversation.
Of a conversation. That's
right.
Not how we think about these things, I don't think.
No, so
we're more passive recipients, maybe, but he was seeing this as a dialogue.
Yes, he was seeing it as an invitation to have a debate.
Isn't that a reflection, to some extent, of the time that debates really thrived?
Yes,
and in fact, wasn't Kalam, the whole discipline, based on a back and forth, a dialectic of
yes. I mean, the question and answer format.
The question and answer,
and what a book doesn't do is talk back.
Right.
It can present you with all sorts of questions, but your answers to those questions it can't respond to. And so it's a dead end from that point of view.
Without a human context.
Yes. So there always has to be something else at the end. I think that one of the reasons that we can struggle with putting all of these pieces together is that there are some works which seem to me now, after almost 4 decades of reading him, seem to me now to be such invitations to the debate that if we treat them simply as end products, we're missing the point.
Right.
And we tend not to... what I tried to do in some of my works is to identify some of the clues, the textual, the paratext, the textual signs, the markers that suggest, this is what's happening now. So what he will often do is he will recreate debates.
Okay.
Right? And he will present them either as representations of actual debates. You don't know if they are or not, but they're presented as actual debates. So the famous one is the one in which, if you were to do another Google search on Jahiz on translation, you would find a whole different variety of what Jahiz thought about translation, right? And that is because what he does in the Kitab al-Hayawan is he recreates a debate between someone who thinks that poetry can't be translated and someone who thinks it can be.
Just like Plato.
Yes. But what's happened is that people have approached this either looking just for what does Jahiz say on translation, and have read only part of the argument and not the response. Or with Jahiz, what you have to do is you also have to read on both sides of the passage. You have to work out why it's there, what it's reacting to, and what it's leading to. And so what might look like 3 pages of Arabic is in fact 20 pages of Arabic. And if you focus on the 3, you'll get a very, very different view. And that's to say nothing of the fact that the manuscript copies that we have of Jahiz are much later. And so with difficult subject matter, you get errors and problems that
or
that
broken
creep
up
in.
manuscripts. A fragmented manuscript is going to be very unhelpful in that particular way of arguing. Well, another label that has become attached to him, I don't know at what point, is humanist. And that is another tricky label because it's so modern in a way. But it is linked to a kind of hyper-rational approach to knowledge.
Yes.
So where does that label come from, and is it a valuable label? Is it warranted?
So I'm going to separate the two out.
Right.
And try and deal with humanism first and then deal with rationalism. The two are connected and we might get to a joined up answer in the end if I can do it properly. But the humanism first, of course, we've already spoken many times in the course of the discussion about how all of human life is human. And I started off by saying that Jahiz was a scientist, pardon my use of the word, of the human being. Right? And so if it weren't for the history of humanism, I'd be quite happy with calling Jahiz a humanist because his ultimate object, well, not his ultimate, his immediate object is interest in man. His ultimate object is God. So his immediate object is the human animal. And let's say, if that's what we mean by humanist, then that's fine. With a small h, I'm happy with that. If you mean humanist with a capital H, as we normally do, that is, so the closest author within the European tradition that one can come to in comparison with Jahiz is, of course, Michel de Montaigne, the great sort of essayist, whose estate gave us Chateau d'Yquem wines, and
an important contribution to humanity.
One of my favourites, I have to say, which is why every time I think of Montaigne, I think of D'Yquem wines, but I can't afford them. So,
so just buy the essays instead.
So get the essays instead. And then, of course, Montaigne positions himself as the subject.
Yes.
So, right? When he is composing his essays. And he uses himself as the measure of all things. And so on. And this... and so the similarity in the fact that both of them wrote many essays and that both of them were interested in so much of human life. And Jahiz seems to position himself in his work. But actually, I'm sure if some techno-whiz were to excerpt all of the phrases in Jahiz's work in which he speaks in his own voice, we wouldn't have a very big book. So it's a kind of illusion that he positions himself.
A first person.
Yes, that it reflects on himself. I mean, he's evolved, but it doesn't necessarily reflect back on him as an individual and as a human being. And the third aspect that we might touch on again is this. Jahiz comes so early in the Arabic prose writing tradition. We don't have any other books from his period that are comparable. So again, we confront this. We confront this sort of vacuum.
Yes.
How do we position them? And when I think scholarship tries to do this, it tries to look, as I said, for things to compare them with.
Precursors.
Or later examples of,
Right.
of similarities, and so we find Montaigne again, and we get humanism. So from that point of view, the other corollary is that Montaigne is thought of as a free thinker.
Right.
And there's a lot of people who want to see Jahiz as a free thinker.
Right.
I don't think that quite works, because I think he was effectively an apologist for the Abbasid court. And I think that his thought might roam freely, but that doesn't make him a free thinker in the sense of someone who is pitting himself against the rest of society. What Jahiz wants is actually, I think, politically, he is a very, very conservative thinker. He wants all of society organised according to a variety of echelons with no movement in between, no variation, because he believed that God fitted all of us. He fitted me with the equipment to read Jahiz. He fitted you with the equipment to ask me the questions, etc. Right?
Right.
So there's a real sense of determinism,
Right.
and God's sort of activity in plotting out our lives, and so we're all fitted for the professions that we fulfil.
What about the characteristics? So, for example, the misers, are they determined from birth? Or the singing girls, in fact?
We can always pervert what we were intended for.
Right. That's free will.
No, yes, I mean a version of it. Yeah, I think it's we can always willfully come to the wrong conclusions, or mistakenly come to the wrong conclusions,
Right.
and live our life according to the wrong principles. And so what a lot of Al-Jahiz's ethical works are doing is giving us the right principles in order to be able to live in accordance with what God has programmed us to do. So we're not like robots. We're not just sort of machines.
Yeah, living our
We're
lives.
the next level of AI, where we have all the equipment but haven't automatically started to think for ourselves. And it's, for Jahiz, it's the thinking for yourself that is really important. It's reaching your own conclusions for which you will be morally responsible, and for which you will be judged by God on Judgment Day, in terms of, I gave you this equipment, you did this with it, why didn't you do that? And we will be judged or damned based on how we fulfill that criteria. Now, before that sounds so punitive, I would say that because Jahiz was an elitist, there's only very, very few people that this applies to.
I guess that takes the pressure off.
If you, in a somewhat patronising way, if you were
toilet cleaner,
intended by God to be a toilet cleaner, and you did that job properly, and you performed the duties of a Muslim, you'd be rewarded for that and not punished. It's not a punitive system.
Okay.
From that point of view, it's not some kind of dark, bleak morality of the human being. It's more a question. He was more interested in the man of reason, which gets us to rationality.
Well, it is making me question my life choices a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't mean to do that, but you don't have to live your life according to Jahiz's
Jahiz.
dictates. So
That's
I
a
think
relief.
that would be a rather odd life anyway, and I don't think I would like to either. And it's fair to say that reason is absolutely central to how Jahiz looks at the way in which we interpret the world.
Yes.
Does that make him a hard and fast 100% committed rationalist? No. Because, interestingly, alongside reason, he believes in a concept called necessary knowledge.
Right.
It's the best translation I can offer. Necessary knowledge is something that is sort of already inside us.
Oh, innate.
Yes. It is one of the means that allow us, before the age of reason, let's say, so for Jahiz, the age of reason begins after puberty.
Okay.
Up to that point, what are you, right?
Right.
So Jahiz says, well, what do we do with all these children before they become adolescent and move into a state of, as it were, legal responsibility by fulfilling puberty. And so he comes up with this idea that we have certain amount of equipment, cognitive equipment inside us that is almost pre-rational.
Yeah.
I'm saying almost because he's not clear on how exactly it operates. But it's what allows the child to grow and develop and learn from its environment. And he would call this tajriba, experience.
Yeah.
And is what allows us to accept that 2 and 2 equals 4.
Right.
Without having to learn all of arithmetic or anything else. So he would call that necessary. And so there's a category of knowledge that we all have as individuals that for him is concomitant to reason. We also have reason, and we learn how to use reason through the implementation of this cognitive apparatus.
Is teaching necessary for that stage?
I'm not sure that Jahiz was a great advocate of education.
Oh.
Because he would be too liable to abuse. The big the big no-no is what's called taqleed, the unquestioning acceptance of someone else's authority. So if I'm teaching you and I give you a whole list of things as authoritative, and they're either false or falsifiable or perhaps maliciously invented, and I'm brainwashing you, then he doesn't want that.
Yeah.
Right? What he would rather was that the human being be allowed to explore its use of this cognitive apparatus, acquire the rights of reason, and then when able to reason, then be educated. But that's not to say that memorizing the Quran as a child is central.
No.
To this also.
Yeah.
Which would be considered a sufficient education
at the time.
For someone in pre-puberty.
Well, from the beginning to the end, you have argued for his rigorous thought process. Is there anything else that we haven't maybe touched on that you'd like listeners to take away about Jahiz?
Yes, a sense of intellectual adventure.
Yeah.
And to use the right word, it would be fun.
Right.
You have no idea what you're going to read on the one page after the other. It's just full of surprises. And if you open yourself up and embrace it and let it work on you and follow his lead without trying to prejudge him, it can be it's an intellectual roller coaster. And hugely difficult to convey in English, hugely difficult to translate. Because as you know, I'm working on a series of translations of about 15 of his epistles. And my biggest challenge thus far, and the reason that I haven't taken it to the next stage of being ready for publication, is the sheer fact that I can get, I think, the voice right, but I can't get the adventure. And I'm going to have to either say to myself and be honest with my readers that I can't do the sense of adventure, and so throw away my book and go and learn Arabic and join in the fun, or I'm going to have to have a road to Damascus moment where all of a sudden I think, yes, that's how I do it. I'm at this impasse with it.
Well, I hope that moment of epiphany comes because you have communicated that today. So the appreciation is in you. I hope you access that for the translation.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for downloading this podcast.